Okay. Moving on to item number 10, which is public hearing. It's waive reading, read by title only, and introduce an ordinance amending sections of 12 point, well, I'm not going to read them all, but of Chapter 12 regarding temporary signs. Mr. Dowswell.
Yes, Mr. Mayor and Council. This had been scheduled for your prior agenda, and some last-minute edits by the city attorney weren't received in time to discuss it at that meeting, so you held it over to tonight. Just a real brief history. This process started in July of 2007 when then Planning Commissioner Floyd had been contacted by some local businesses concerned about the application of the city's sign ordinance as it related to temporary signs. And to be honest, the ordinance that existed at the time was pretty vague and somewhat subjective as to its interpretation. So working with the Planning Commission over a period of months, we were able to compile some draft examples of other ordinances that we ultimately brought forward to them with some review by the city attorney in February of this year. And the Planning Commission reviewed those changes, discussed a number of issues at the meeting, and then forwarded it on a recommendation to you to approve the ordinance that you have before you tonight. Sort of the key things in the ordinance, we now are going to permit businesses, the city that is, will permit businesses to have A-frame signs. We've historically had them in the communities that I've worked in. It's always been a problem. Cities either choose not to enforce their ordinances or aggressively enforce them. Either way, they tend to be problems, so we've decided to sort of meet a compromise, allow A-frame signs, one per business. In areas except for the downtown, they have to be placed on private property. In the downtown, through an encroachment permit process, they could be placed on public right-of-way. And there'll be some criteria that those businesses that want to take advantage of the situation will have to meet. The other issue was temporary banners. We had an ordinance that put a limit as to how long you could have a temporary banner. It was 120 days. The Planning Commission ultimately decided that as long as somebody maintained a temporary banner, that it didn't exceed the allowable square footage, and it was placed in a proper location, that they should be allowed to have a temporary banner basically year-round. And so that was one of the changes that came from the Planning Commission's review. Third issue was streamers, and don't know how familiar you are with the auto industry, but typically they use these small pennants that are on long strings to draw attention to the used car lot or new car lot on a particular auto dealer site. We've now put in a provision that allows that as well, and that was something that DePratt Ford and the new Thrifty Auto Sales were encouraging us to do. Planning Commission and city staff. And then the last thing was a prohibition on mobile signs. Mr. Short, who's here tonight, who was at your last meeting, had a mobile sign that he towed behind a vehicle that at one point he parked in some locations and ultimately ended up displaying it on his business lot where he's located. There wasn't a prohibition, actually, and Mr. Short realized that. We realized that we didn't want to allow those things, and so we drafted an amendment to the code that would make it clear to a future person that mobile signs would not be permitted. Mr. Short came to the Planning Commission meeting and asked that because of a recent investment he had made in that sign that he be allowed essentially to keep his until the 1st of July. And so there's an exception, or not an exception, there's a clause that was added to the ordinance under mobile signs that says that all mobile signs must be removed by the 1st of July. And Mr. Short's here to speak for himself, but he seemed agreeable to that compromise. Just for the record, I know you got a second staff report, and there were some edits that, even though the city attorney gave them to me, I failed to include in your staff report. And this addendum staff report indicates what those were. They're italicized changes. Just for the record, though, if you look at the initial staff report that you received, there were two areas that were crossed out. One was 122003Q2, and I put at the end of it, not needed. because it's in the definition section. That was a phrase that Mr. Dean added to that section. So I want you to understand that that section is not being struck from the existing ordinance, it's being struck from the draft ordinance that the Planning Commission considered. And there is a similar comment on the next page regarding portable signs. And again, because it's addressed elsewhere in the draft ordinance, it was a redundancy that Mr. Dean felt that wasn't needed. So I point that out so that when you get the second ordinance, second reading ordinance in 2 weeks, you will see that those sections have been dropped out. Dropped out from what the Planning Commission reviewed, not dropped out from the ordinances that exist today. And those are pretty much it. Those are the high points. We did a lot of other sort of clarifying changes to add definitions and some other things to make this ordinance easier for a business to understand should they come in and apply for a permit for one of these types of signs. And with that, I'll try to answer any questions.